Well, we are honored to be here, Pastor David, that invitation and just the warm welcome I received from Danny and from Jack and from Jimmy Knott. In fact, Jimmy Knott and I go way back. Danny was an intern when I first came here. This would have been back in the 80s, I think it was, and we came and did an event for the single group. Jimmy Knott was the head of that, and so we are always honored to come back and be part of this great congregation, world-renowned, and just your heart for ministry, your heart for Christ, and all that you've done. So I'm privileged to be here and humbled by that. So thank you. The boy was 5 years old. They were in church on a Sunday morning. He and his dad were seated in the very front pew, and they had that modesty wall there. And the mother was singing in the choir, and the little 5-year-old boy kept kicking the modesty wall. And his dad said, "Stop." And so he'd stop for a few seconds, and then he'd start kicking it again. His dad would say, "Stop." And then he'd start kicking it again, and this went on about 6 or 7 times, and finally the dad had it. So he stands up, grabs the boy, puts him over his shoulder, starts stepping down the pew, starts walking down the aisle. Of course, everybody's locked up because they see what's going on. And as he's carrying the boy out, the little boy yells out, "You all pray for me now!" So I don't know how many of you have preschoolers, but that's how life is. In fact, how many of you are parents? Yeah. How many of you had parents? Yeah, okay. So the message today should be relevant to either group. And so here we have this 5-year-old, but it's not just the preschoolers. I mean, it can be a teenager, and the challenge there. In fact, sophomore is a compound word. A 16-year-old boy, for instance, we call them sophomores. Why? It's a compound word of Sophia, wisdom, and more, a moron. And they're coming in and out of it. They're the wisest individual we've ever seen, and the next hour they're a moron. It's just the fluctuation. But this Mrs. Hughes was her name. She apparently was just a hilarious woman, and her friends said, "You need to go on a comedy show, stand-up comedy. You need to enter this contest, because you're just hilarious." And so she did this 8-minute thing that went viral on the internet. Maybe you've seen it. And she talks about her children, her experiences, but she has this one place where she says, I think she's from Brooklyn, she said, "Yeah, my son, he's a teenager, and he had an attitude. And he was whining. He was complaining. He was saying to me, 'Well, if you didn't want me, if you didn't want me, why'd you have me?' I said, 'We didn't know it was going to be you.'" I love that. So, I don't know if your children are 5 years old or if they're teenagers, but parenting is no easy matter. And I want to share with you the challenges that are before us. I've often said I would have been a great parent had it not been for my kids. They just kept interfering. But I want to take us into a text that perhaps you haven't thought about. It's the story of the prodigal. And it's a story that we're all familiar with, but I want to look at it from the angle of a parent. And actually, we're going to see the true meaning of the story of the prodigal. I actually title this the father of the prodigal and the judgmental. The story is about 2 brothers, not just one. And the story is about the second brother that's not the prodigal. And we'll see that. He's the judgmental, which is really the point of the parable. But let's look at Luke 15. And I've got some pictures that will go along with this to kind of give us a little idea. But Jesus is speaking, and he said, "A man had 2 sons. The younger of them said to his father, 'Father, give me the share of the estate that falls to me.' So he divided his wealth between them." And here you see a European depiction of that scene. The boy is kind of standing there demanding. The Europeans kind of thought it was all about them. This has nothing with an Israeli flair to it whatsoever. It's all European, so I don't know what they were envisioning. But nonetheless, these are some great classic pieces of art. There's the father and dividing the wealth, and everything is kind of representative of that. I think a truer depiction would be something like that. He's giving him his portion. In the back is the older brother. There you see the mother, who's not part of the story, but no doubt she was alive. It could have been a single parent. And not many days later, the younger son gathered everything together and went on a journey into a distant country. And there he squandered his estate with loose living. Again, the European depiction, this is a tavern. It wouldn't have been like that. but nonetheless, they're trying to make the point. He's squandering it. He's taking it, and he's spending it on prostitutes, and sex, and booze, and he made a mess of himself. Now, when he had spent everything, a severe famine occurred in that country, and he began to be impoverished. So he went and hired himself out to be one of the citizens of that country, and he sent him into his fields to feed swine. And let me stop there. That idea of the swine, he's a Jew. That's not kosher. I mean, so he's at the lowest of the low. He is very destitute at this point, feeding pigs. And he would have gladly filled his stomach with the pods that the swine were eating, and no one was giving anything to him. So here you see another picture of this. You see the pigs in the background, the field, and he's beginning to ponder. He's beginning to think, but you can see he's hungry. He's at the end of his rope. So we continue. But when he came to his senses, he said, "How many of my father's hired men have more than enough bread? But I'm dying here with hunger. I will get up and go to my father and will say to him, 'Father, I have sinned against heaven and in your sight. I'm no longer worthy to be called your son. Make me as one of your hired men.' So he got up and came to his father. But while he was still a long way off, his father saw him." Here's a depiction, one artist, the gray, the white, but yet this says something. His dad was watching on an ongoing basis, apparently. At some point during the day, he's a very wealthy man, a very successful man, but there is this, is my son coming? Could he be returning? He doesn't know, but Jesus says he's watching, he's waiting, he's looking, he sees him. Let's continue. And he felt compassion for him. And notice, he does not know. We know why the son's returning. He doesn't know why the son is returning. We do. Could be that he's coming back for more money. But you see the feeling this dad has in his heart toward this son, apart from anything the boy's about to do. Very significant statement. Felt compassion for him. And what does he do? He ran. Let's look at this. This would be probably an accurate picture of a Jewish dad at that time. He sees his son. He perhaps knows the gait of his son's walk. He can tell. But he doesn't know exactly why that son's coming. Maybe the still hedonistic, self-centered sexualist is coming at him. He doesn't care. He loves him, and he runs. And we read, and he embraced him and kissed him. And this really captures well. I love the artist's rendition of the father's face. You can see the depth of his emotion. Powerful. Powerful. Again, Jesus is telling us this story. Let's continue. And the son said to him, "Father, I have sinned against heaven and in your sight. I'm no longer worthy to be called your son." And notice the father doesn't even engage that. That's assumed. You're forgiven. Let's move on. I love this. He doesn't even acknowledge what the boy said. It's kind of like he gets it. It's happened. And the father said to his slaves, "Quickly, bring out the best robe and put it on him, and put a ring on his hand and sandals on his feet. And bring that fattened calf and kill it, and let us eat and let us celebrate. For this son of mine was dead, and he's come to life again. He was lost and has been found." And they began to celebrate. And this picture captures all those things, the ring, the robe, and if you study it closely, you'll see that the artist in Europe, again, captures the point of the parable. But let's continue. Here's the point, really, of the parable. Now his older son was in the field, and when he came and approached the house, he heard music and dancing. And he summoned one of the servants and began inquiring what these things could be. And he said to him, the servant did, "Your brother has come, And your father has killed the fattened calf because he's received him back safe and sound. But he became angry and was not willing to go in. And his father came out and began pleading with him. But he answered and said to his father, "Look, for so many years I've been serving you, and I've never neglected a command of yours, and yet you have never given me a young goat even, so that I might celebrate with my friends. But when the son of yours came, who has devoured your wealth with prostitutes, you killed the fattened calf for him." And he said to him, "Son, you have always been with me, and all that is mine is yours. But we had to celebrate and rejoice, for this brother of yours was dead and has begun to live, and was lost and has been found." The story ends. And this is the point of the story. The deepest point is that there would be this tension between the Jews, who were these righteous, godly people who had lived faithfully, and the future entrance into the kingdom of God of the Gentiles that Jesus knew was coming, plus Jews who had been living sinful lives, like the Jewish prostitutes, the Jewish tax gatherers. These were the sinners that surrounded and became friends of Jesus. And Jesus knew that this grace and love would be extended to them, that there would be this compassion. But he knew that the Jews are going to have a serious problem with this. And so he gives this parable to the Jews. This isn't really about the prodigal. It's not about the father. It is about the self-righteous, angry judgmentalism of the Jews. And there's no indication that the older brother had anything to do with his father's appeal. Now, where did this story come from? There are 66 some parables, and Jesus speaks these, and they're absolutely brilliant from a literary standpoint. I mean, what we call the strictness of parallelism, the way in which the parable is spoken spontaneously, and yet how it fits perfectly, almost at a series of levels. And obviously, they're so brilliant, it's as though God spoke them. But here you have one that came at this moment, and the question is, did Abba Father just reveal this to Jesus? Could have, but you remember for years he was a carpenter. I have a hunch that he saw that story go down. And then he understood the deeper significance of it with regard to the kingdom and the Jews and the Gentiles. And I mean, this is speculation on my part, but I have a hunch he saw a father like that. And he saw a younger son like that. And he saw an older son like that. Now, my question to you is this. Would we have this father come for 2 days and lecture us on how to parent? I mean, he's got this indulgent, hedonistic, self-centered, sexual, sensual secondborn. He's got this self-righteous, judgmental, angry firstborn. What is he going to tell us about parenting? May I say to you that we are not going to invite him to come to lecture us on how to be a parent. But here's the point. Jesus Christ holds this father up as a replica of Abba Father. He represents the heart of God. To Jesus, he parented God's way. He modeled Abba. The question is, did he touch the heart of God, this father? I'm going to share with you that he did. That you can be successful in the eyes of God. You can touch the heart of God on how you parent, even though you have 2 kids like he had. Some of you have lived in shame because your children are being disobedient. And you've concluded that you are somehow not a good person, that you're not worthy, that you're no longer qualified. You may not be qualified for the eldership, but you've disqualified yourself for all ministry. You've become so ashamed, you've put yourself on the shelf. This is deep because who we are as parents is top priority. We might be succeeding in a lot of other areas, but in this area we feel like a failure, and we begin to think that maybe we've disappointed God. We obviously did something wrong. Others of us may even be resentful toward God because, well, Proverbs 22:6, if you bring your child up in the ways of the Lord, when he's older, he'll not depart from them. So your child is departed. So therefore, God promised. I've had women write me, I hate God because he didn't fulfill his promise. Proverbs 22:6 is a principle, not a promise. Rehoboam was the son of Solomon who wrote this. My son, my son, my son, the refrain throughout Proverbs. He's writing to Rehoboam first and foremost. And when Rehoboam became king, he was one of the most wicked kings in Israel. And he didn't listen to one thing his dad said. He did the opposite of what his dad said. The wisest man on the planet, and Yahweh appeared to Solomon 2 times, and this kid rejected it all. And he knew. And you have a whole bunch of scriptures where parents are treated in a violent way by their kids. Their children steal from them. They are violent with them. They lie to them. They curse them. You read the whole book of Proverbs, it doesn't land just on Proverbs 22:6. Or to illustrate my point, these are pithy statements, and you have to understand it's a principle. Some apply here, some don't. So you have one verse that says, answer a fool according to his folly, and the very next verse says, do not answer a fool according to his folly. Well, which is it? The answer is it depends on the circumstance. You have to understand these are principles. The hand of the diligent makes rich, Proverbs says. So if you don't have money, then you're a lazy person. Well, we would never do that. It's a basic principle. Or the righteous shall live a long life. Jesus was crucified at age 33, so what's that make him? You need to understand every text has a context. And you need to interpret any particular scripture in light of the whole. It doesn't mean that Proverbs 22:6 is untrue. It means it's a principle. There's no absolute guarantee. You might say if you don't bring them up in the ways of the Lord and you hate them, you kick them, you beat them up, you do everything, then they're probably not going to follow. I want you to take this guilt off, and we want to take a look at how you can succeed as a parent in God's eyes. And I'm going to share with you how you touch the heart of God, how you succeed as a parent in God's eyes. And here's the radical, maybe heretical statement. It has nothing to do with your kids. I wrote an article that was picked up by Fox News. I was amazed. It went kind of just exploded. I was amazed they even pushed it out there. But the title of the article was, Why Biblical Parenting Has Nothing to Do with Your Kids. Now, is this heresy? Well, let's see if I can make the case when you leave here today and see if it's true or untrue. I want to ask and answer 3 questions. Who am I really as a parent? I mean, who am I really? We're going to answer that question. I mean, who am I really in this parenting process? Second question is, who are my children really? Who are they really? And thirdly, who is Christ in all of this really? Who am I? Who are my children? And who is Christ in all of this? First question, who am I really as a parent? I will answer that as best I can. I am a moral, spiritual being who is free to love or not love. I am a moral, spiritual being who is free to love or not love. And to succeed in the eyes of God as a parent, I must choose to love my children no matter what. And when I choose to love my children no matter what, I am succeeding in the eyes of God. I am touching the heart of God. The father of the prodigal and the father of the judgmental. It should be the father of the prodigal and judgmental. It should actually be a parable. The father of the judgmental. That when this man had to deal with these 2 sons, you can clearly see at some point in his life he made a decision. I'm going to be a loving man independent of who my sons are. I'm going to be a man of compassion. I'm not going to give my children license to do what they want to do. And we're going to explain that. I used to read that story and think, man, why would he give them his inheritance? Is he a passive, permissive parent that's just kind of letting his son go off and indulge? And I'm going to explain that in a moment. But here's this father that you see running with compassion. Why? Because that's who he was. You know, I remember as a parent in my earlier days, I had to come to a point, I remember kind of processing this, that God calls me to be a loving parent independent of my children. And I have to make a decision. I have to have this moment where I have this huge yes to that. Will I love my children no matter what? Am I going to say a big yes to that? Every day they irritated me at some level. And so every day there had to be a little yes and a reminder of that. And there was never perfection. I found myself seeking forgiveness more for being unloving than perhaps being loving. But nonetheless, there was this moment when I said, I'm going to be this kind of person independent of my kids. You know, I had to come to this point. I knew God loved me. I knew I had worth in Christ. I'd come to Christ at age 16. He had changed my life. I knew God loved me. I knew He was for me. I had a sense of self-worth because of that. But the question was, would I bring my identity in Christ to my parenting, or was I going to derive my identity from my parenting? That is a critical question that all of us have to ask, because what happens subconsciously and inadvertently is, if my children obey, then I feel good about myself. And when they disobey, I feel bad about myself. And over a period of time, I begin to send a message that your performance is the key to my happiness. And when you're disobedient, I'm unhappy, and I don't feel good about myself. Well, I tell you, kids have a hard enough time obeying on their own to suddenly become my therapist. And we don't intend to do that. But in effect, that's the message we send, and they'll shut down. We'll exasperate them according to Colossians 3:21, and they will lose heart. They'll just close off. But when we come to that point where we say, I'm going to be a loving person independent of you, I free them up as well. But the truth is, I am free. I am free. And I'm going to bring my identity in Christ to my parenting. But each of us has to ask that question. Are you who you are because of your kids? Or are you who you are in spite of your kids? It's a critical point. Are you a loving person, independent of them? Or are you only loving when they're lovable? Each of us has to come to that point where we make that decision. I was raised in a family, we were not Christ followers. I came to Christ, as I mentioned, when I was 16. And fortunately, 2 years later, when I was a freshman at Wheaton, my mom knew that I was a Christian, so she joined a Bible study. She opened her heart to Christ. Then my dad was watching all this, and he opened his heart to Christ. My sister, she was 5 years older, she opened her heart to Christ. She was married to Fred, who's a professor. My brother-in-law opened his heart to Christ. My whole family came to Christ my freshman year. But that was when I was 18. There were a whole series of wounds. As I mentioned in this video, when I was 2.5, I saw my dad attempt to strangle my mother. And after my dad had died, I never had surfaced that. My mom's a widow, and this was years later. I mean, Christ had come into him, changed him, but I said to Mom, I have this memory. Well, when I began to describe the sequence, she was aghast. She was in shock. She said, you can't remember that. You were too little. And I said, well, what I described, did it happen? She said, yes. So that did happen, yes. Well, that affected me. I wet the bed until I was 11. Not that you needed to know that. But at age 11, I learned that my dad was committing adultery. There was a scene where I remember picking up this butcher knife, and I was in the kitchen with Mom. And my mom was a very successful woman. She had 3 businesses, very dynamic woman, just an incredible personality. And I picked up this butcher knife and said to Mom, I'm going to kill Dad. Now, it was false bravado. I had no intentions of doing that. But my mother freaked out. I'd never seen her freaked out. But she demanded I put that knife down. I thought, whoa, I pushed it way too far. But my dad was in the other room, and something had happened. My dad had a rage issue. He had horrible rage. But it was soon after that my mom decided I needed to go to military school. So from age 13 to 18, for the next 5 years, I was at Missouri Military Academy because there was a head-on collision with my father. And my mother saw that. We were not Christ followers, but she just sensed that this is what's necessary. And I'm very thankful for that. But then we changed. But I will tell you that my dad's fuse was very short. He exploded, and he avoided me, basically. And he worked nights and at railroad. He was a yard master, and so he tried to avoid me. He never came to any game, not one event, never came to anything. I was quite athletic, did a lot of things at military school, very successful, never came to one thing. I remember even 18 in one of the parades seeing a silhouette of a man that looked like my dad, 6'3", about 240 pounds. He finally came, and as we marched by, it wasn't him. And I thought I'd already gotten over it as an 18-year-old. The longing in my heart Now, my dad was not an evil-willed man. He was a depression baby. And Mom used to always say he doesn't know how to be a daddy because he lost his daddy when he was 3 months in the flu epidemic in 1918 in South Dakota. There was a flu that came across the country, and many people died, thousands, hundreds of thousands. And your grandfather died, and so your daddy doesn't know how to be a daddy because he didn't have a daddy. So I had an empathy for my father, and my mother continued to preach that to me. Yet I was hurt by my dad, and my dad lost my heart. There was an episode, for instance, we had the swimming pool. We taught swimming, and my dad would stay out of the pool because when he was in, I would get in to play with him. But one day it was very hot, so he got in even though I was around. And I was probably 8 years old, and immediately I was on him like a fly. And I was just all over him. Remember, I just wanted to play. And I irritated him. He would just go, and boom, it was never any warning. And so, but this time he was just upset with me, so he pushes me under and stands on me. 6'4", as I said, and I thought he was playing with me, and I could hold my breath a long time, so I'm under there about a minute to try to impress him. And I'm thinking, this is play. I'm in play mode. And even though he kind of threw me under. And so here I am, and I'm ready to get up. And he doesn't let me up. I'm trying to get up, and he's just putting his weight down and almost squeezing the air out. I'm going to inhale. I'm going to die. He's trying to drown me. And at the last second, he lets me up, and I come up. And I remember going back in the water, looking at him, thinking, a daddy ought not to treat his boy this way. And when Paul said in Colossians 3:21, do not exasperate your children so they lose heart. Not only did I lose heart, my dad lost my heart. I didn't hate him. I just became indifferent to him because I wasn't going to let him hurt me anymore. See, my dad did not come to a point where he made a decision in his own heart. What does it mean to be a loving person independent of this irritating little kid? He hadn't made that decision. Children are going to be obnoxious. They're going to kick the front pew. They're going to whine. Why'd you have me? They're not pleasant to live with. But I will tell you, as a parent, we are free. We are free to love or not love. That's our decision. They don't control that. And when I make a decision to love independent of them, I touch the heart of Christ. You know, years ago, there was a young African-American, young boy, 14 or thereabout. He was being sold on a block of wood, and he was about to be bidded on by all these slave owners. And before the bidding began, one of the slave owners came up to him and whispered, son, if I buy you, will you be honest? The young man looked at him and said, sir, whether you buy me or not, I will be honest. I love that. This is who I am, independent of you. This is who I am. And who you are is irrelevant to me. Years ago, there was a Frenchman during the Nazi regime. He was a Christian. He loved Jesus Christ, and he was harboring Jews until one day he was discovered. And he was brought before a man who was known as the Torturer, Nazi SS officer. And as he came into the presence of this Nazi who was going to confront him on this, the peace of Christ came over this Christian Frenchman. Just the peace of Christ. Peace I give to you, not as the world do I give you, but my peace I give to you. So he just had the peace of Christ. Let the peace of Christ rule your heart. The peace that passes on. He just experienced peace, and so there was a calmness. Well, this officer saw that, and no one had that kind of look. So he interpreted that as snideness, as a smirk. And he screamed at him, get that smirk off your face. Don't you know who I am? And the Frenchman said, yes, sir, I know who you are. You're known as the torturer. You have the power and the authority to torture me and kill me. Sir, I know who you are. But sir, you do not have the power to get me to hate you. Remember when Jesus said they slap you in the right cheek, turn the left? Why? Because we're wimps? Or if they make you go 1 mile, go 2. Why? Because we're milquetoast? No. They control you physically, but you take over spiritually. Because you are a moral, spiritual being who is free. This is who you are. And when they come into the presence of that, they come under conviction. Because they're in the presence of greatness. This is who I am. Have you come to a point with your children where you've said to yourself, and maybe even to them, there is nothing you can do to get me to hate you. I will always love you. You're like the Father, running. Because this is who I am. I have a principle, my response is my responsibility. At one level, I hate that. My response is my responsibility. Because you see, I want my response to be your responsibility. But I have the statement, my response is my responsibility. You don't cause me to be the way I am. You reveal the way I am. Therefore, if my response is unloving, it's my issue. But everything in my heart wants to blame you and justify myself. But the truth is, my response is my responsibility. Now, that's intimidating at one level, but it's very liberating at another, because my response is my responsibility. You can't cause me to hate you. You can only reveal my choice to hate you. You know, a speck of sand in the human eye first causes irritation. Then, if not cared for, infection, and if still not cared for, can lead to loss of vision. That same little speck of sand in an oyster first causes irritation, then concretion, and then produces what? A pearl. Now, did the sand cause the results in the human eye? Did the sand cause the results in the oyster? Technically, no. If it did, next time you get sand in your eye, be careful. A pearl may pop out. But that's not going to happen. The sand is an irritant that reveals the inner property of the human eye. The sand is an irritant that reveals the inner properties of the oyster. Your children are irritants. It's true. My children irritated me. But what they did is they revealed who I am. The good and the bad. And I had to come to a point where I realized whether they respected me or were lovable, that's an irrelevant point. The question is, would I respond to the opportunity they afforded me to demonstrate to myself and to Christ that I'd made a decision to be a loving person independent of them? And I was forever trying to let them know I love them. I didn't love them and let them have license. I was very firm. I went to military school. I'm a big disciplinarian. The book, I talk about how to discipline, love, and respect. You can talk about, we're not talking about being permissive and passive and just letting them do whatever. I used to say to kids, though, I love you so much, I would, if you were in a burning car, I'd come in after you. That's how much I love you. But get up to your room. You're grounded all afternoon for what you did. In fact, I asked the kids as adults, I said, do you remember me saying that to you? And Jonathan, who's a clinical psychologist, and we do the Love and Respect podcast together. He's my executive manager. Joy, who she's worked 10 years with us, did a thing called Love and Respect Now, started the millennials. She's been very burdened about that. But I asked each of the children what they felt about this, and Jonathan said, well, I felt very secure by that statement. So I said, David, you know, Dad, I really felt loved. I really did. I said, Joy, were there a lot of burning cars in the neighborhood? You know, but there comes a moment when who they are or who they aren't is irrelevant. I mean, there were times the kids would say, you're the worst parent on the planet. I'd say, yes, finally, I'm number one at something. I love it, the superlatives. Hey, but nice try. Get to your room. I'm not running a popularity contest. I don't care what you feel about me. Fine. In fact, I'm kind of excited about being number one. So, I chose to be who I was because I realized my dad didn't. And I realized as a little boy, this isn't me. I'm just a kid. This is his issue. He'd get in such a rage, he'd spit blood. He threw furniture out the house. Now when Christ came into him, he changed my dad. He was a changed man. He would weep as he listened to the hymns because he was raised by a godly, wise mother, but he rejected it. She was a strong believer. I never knew her. But he rejected it, and we talked later on. The Spirit of God descended on me, and I said, Dad, you think the Spirit of God skipped over you onto me? He said, absolutely. My mother prayed. I said, so all those years you knew Christ and never talked to me about it? He said, I knew of him, but no, I didn't want him. Didn't want him. But this idea of my response and my responsibility, that's why Titus 2, for instance, you mothers love your children, but Titus 2 says the older women are to encourage the younger women to love their children. The Greek word there is phileo, not agape. God has put it in your heart to agape love your children. You feel love for your children, but the question is, do they feel the love that you feel for them? I knew my dad loved me, but I didn't feel the love that he had for me. And there's a difference. Just because you love your children doesn't mean they feel the love that you have for them. And Titus 2, the older women are saying to the younger women, phileo is Philadelphia, brotherly love. Women who are exhausted, young mothers, they're exhausted, they're tired, they're negative, they're unfriendly. You say to the children, does your mommy love you? Oh, yeah, she loves us a lot. Does she like you? No, we've been bad today. And in the home, you're not that sweet woman. You know it. Those closed doors, you are angry, you're unfriendly, and they don't feel the love even though they know you love them. And the older women are to say, sweetie, it's okay. We've been through this. Come on, come on, come on. They're not causing you to be that way. You made a decision. Pull back, pull back, pull back. You're free. You're free. You don't have to be that way. Don't blame them. They're not to blame. This is your issue. Or you have Ephesians 6. Paul says in 6:4, fathers, do not provoke your children to anger. Colossians, we've already quoted, do not exasperate children so they lose heart. Fathers, you can love your children, you can have compassion for your children, but you can feel provoked. This was my dad. He felt provoked to anger, and he would provoke me to anger. He was exasperated and was losing heart, so he exasperated me and lost heart. I think Paul is very deep here, and it's very simple. You who are provoking your children to anger, you're probably feeling provoked to anger, and so it's tit for tat. And so you're the adult, you'll get back. Might makes right. Or they're exasperating you, you're losing heart, so you'll exasperate them to lose heart to teach them a lesson. And then you have in your mindset that they're causing this. They're not causing this. They're revealing this. And in the process, though, here's the deal. God's not evaluating you based on their performance. God is evaluating you based on your obedience to Him. And you can touch the heart of Christ if you make a decision to be a loving person independent of your kids no matter what. And you will touch Christ's heart regardless of how your children turn out. Have you made that choice? Have you made it? Or have you said, I am unloving because they are disobedient? I will remind you, Psalm 103 says, as a father has compassion on his children. That's what we see, the father prodigal. Or Isaiah 49:15, can a mother not have compassion on her children? Let me encourage you to be that compassionate person, even if they don't deserve it. Because when you are that way, God is pleased. There's a second question. Who is my child? Really? Who is my child really? Your child is a moral, spiritual being who is free to respond to your love or your lack of love. And you who are adult children, you are free. Even though I was wounded by my father, I was not damaged goods. But there can come a point when we think, because of my parents' failures, I'm damaged goods. No. You are a moral, spiritual being who is free. You are free. Yes, you're wounded. And yes, life is not fair. Yes, you're treated unjustly. But the truth is, where there is sin, grace abounds, Paul says. And actually, the wounds that you feel, Paul says, God is the God of all comfort who comforts us in all of our afflictions so that we may be able to comfort those in afflictions. But he doesn't answer the question why we were afflicted in the first place. He's mum. It's silent. You have to make a decision. The affliction came. No answer is given as to why it came. But will I become a conduit to be a source and a means of comfort to others who need it? Or will I become bitter and stop it right there and become stagnant like the Dead Sea? Or will I be a conduit? I will tell you that I made a decision that my wounds would turn me into a wounded healer in that process of allowing those pains to enable me to minister better to other people. But you have to come to that point. But I tell you, when you do, the opportunities, the ministry to be used in other people's lives is incredible. There was this surgeon that amputated the legs of a soldier, and both legs had to be removed. And when the soldier came to, the doctor was there beside him. And he said, I had to amputate both of these. And the kid looks and screams at the doctor. But the doctor says, I understand, son. And he screams even more, you don't understand. And he curses him and just goes off on him. And the doctor says, I do understand. Quiet. And he raises up both of his legs, pant legs, and he has artificial limbs. And the boy looks at them and breaks into tears sobbing as they embrace. That's how God wants to use your wounds. Or will you be shaking your fist? So as an adult child, you are free. But as a parent, you need to understand the other side of this. Your children are free. They are free, moral, spiritual beings who will make their own decisions. So we have to come to a point where if we're going to succeed in the eyes of God insofar as our parenting, I must come to this realization that I must influence the heart of my children God's way. I must influence the heart of my child God's way. And what's interesting, the father, the prodigal, he understood that he understood, and maybe instinctively, that he was going to be a loving person, and he was going to appeal to his son lovingly. We don't know how it went down in terms of him saying, I don't want you to take the inheritance, but it's your right, and you've got to learn your lesson on your own. But he knew that if he was compassionate and loving, that if anything was going to win the heart of his son, this would. And guess where the boy returns when he comes to his senses? To this father full of compassion. And he comes back just to be a hired hand. He doesn't come back to get more. He just says, I'll serve. And as far as we know, that's what he did. But he returns because this father influenced the heart of his son by this love. But you need to understand that kind of influence is limited because he didn't have the power to coerce the son into being obedient in the first place by not taking the inheritance. And he never affected, as he begged and appealed to the older son to be forgiving. He wanted nothing to do with it. Here's the deal. Parenting only has so much influence. There's limitations. And once I realized this liberated me because God does not intend for us to coerce and control our children. I want to explain that. But here's the deal. I can give to my children and I can demand that they say thank you. But I cannot coerce them to have a grateful heart. I can be understanding and empathetic toward my children, but they may not want anything to do with that. I can instruct my children, but they may not be teachable. I can discipline them, but internally they can choose to still be rebellious. I can encourage them as best I know how, but they've got to make the internal choice to be confident and courageous. I can pray for them, but that doesn't mean they're going to trust Jesus Christ. Why? Because they're moral, spiritual beings who are free to respond to love or free not to. That is true truth. That's why Proverbs 22:6 needs to be understood in that context. You do that, you're creating the most loving environment that best motivates your children to choose your faith and values, but there's no guarantee. Jesus himself taught that there would be children turning their parents over to the authorities to be murdered. And he didn't blame the parents. Those were the evil choices of their children. We're truncated in the way we interpret Scripture. We just ignore what Jesus said because we've got a psychological framework that we abide by. Good parents have good kids, bad parents have bad kids, end of deal. Your kids are bad, you're bad. Your kids are good, you're good. And both of those can be absolute lies. Because in Scripture you see two other scenarios. Good parents have bad kids, father the prodigal. And bad parents have good kids. Who? One illustration is Josiah, king of Israel. He became king at age 8. At age 16, it said he began to seek the Lord, and for the next couple decades he reformed all of Israel. But his father and grandfather were wicked dudes. Wicked. Bad parent, good kid. Why? Because we are moral, spiritual beings who are free to decide. You're not damaged goods if your parents are horrible. You are free. And you can become that wounded healer. But you can be this godly, wise parent who has a child who rebels against you, and it has nothing to do with you. It is their decision. And in the eyes of Christ, you are touching the heart of God. And you're succeeding in his eyes. Like the father, the prodigal, who represents Abba. This is powerful stuff. And that's where I had to come to that point then where I realized, you know what, I cannot control the ultimate outcomes in my children. I can only control my actions and reactions to my children. And that's the way God intended it. Now early on we control our tots. But we move from that 24/7 absolute control of the tot so he doesn't run into the street to we have to move to counsel with our teenagers. Because you can't control them 24/7. Then you move from counsel to cast off. Jesus said, a son shall leave father and mother and cleave to his wife. These are not children, might makes right, that you can control. You're raising future spouses and parents. These are little people that are going to become big people. But the whole goal is to get rid of them. But this idea that I can control only when they're tots. What do you do when you have to move here into counsel? If you continue to try to control and coerce, it's not going to work. So as the father of the prodigal, you have to begin to appeal, and there's a risk. But the question is, do you want them to internalize this? I mean, you think of the Amish community. In fact, we're the #1 book among the Amish. In fact, we'll have our marriage conferences, and there'll be 40 Amish in the back. Those who have left the community will come with their vans and pick them all up. And they have in the Amish community that go to this love and respect thing. It's of the light. They call us of the light. This is of the light. So they come. But they'll talk about the fact that when they turn 18, you're out. And you have to make the decision whether you want to be committed to us for the rest of your life. This is your decision for yourself. It's not our decision for you. They've learned that. Just as the Jews, when you became bar mitzvah, you were 13. Maybe this boy was 14, 15, 16. We don't know. But he had a right to the inheritance. He was given it. But you're responsible. And the dad knew that I can't coerce you into being wise. He knew in his heart as a loving father that my son is a fool, but he's got to hit the wall. I cannot control that internal decision. The only thing we can do then is to create the most loving environment that best motivates our children to choose our faith and values. And when we choose to be this loving person and we choose to influence their heart by appealing to their heart, by appealing to that moral spiritual being within, and we do that in a loving way, that if anything is going to probably persuade them to come to our faith and come to our values, that's going to be it. And because what's happening is I've really got the real disease of love and Christ in my heart, and I've got the real disease, and then I sneeze on my kids, and it's contagious, and they get the real disease too. But it's more about who I am in relationship to them than about who they are in relationship to me. They're in that process of trying to discover that. So what I want to be is that appetizing element in their life. Because why? They're moral, spiritual beings who have to make their own decision. Robert Coles, the Harvard psychiatrist, used to subscribe to the idea that children were a clean slate. And he's the one that interviewed Ruby, who was the first African-American who was integrated into the school system. She was like 6 or 7. He interviewed her and said, "How are you dealing with it?" "I just pray to Jesus for them." He said to himself, and he wrote out, "This is just a religious cloak to disguise her hidden fears." But as the years went on, he began to listen to the stories. They started coming back of other people. There was a white boy who stood between a black kid and a white gang, and he asked him why he did, and he said, "Something in me just drew the line." And he began to realize, and he shifted his position, that children are moral, spiritual beings who make their own decisions apart from their environment. And they can do that because they're free. They've studied kids who witnessed in the genocides in Africa the butchering by machete of their parents, and they realized as the clinicians and the sociologists studied them that they weren't in trauma. They weren't psychologically damaged. Why? Because they chose to forgive. Why? Because they understood the reality of evil. And they chose to forgive, and it resulted in wholeness. Some of us, our mother didn't give us the inheritance, and we're bitter souls because you didn't get enough. We've really warped ourselves in this culture. But from a biblical standpoint, your children, though, are free, moral, spiritual beings, and they're going to have to make that decision for good and God or for the other way, the carnal flesh. So what you want to do is to create this most loving environment. Here's the deal. If you choose to create the most loving environment that best motivates your children to influence their heart as best you can and they don't respond, you're still successful in the eyes of Christ. And some of you have done that for 30 years and your children have resisted you and you've concluded that you're messed up or there's something bad about you. No, no, no. You have no idea what's coming on that day. Think of all the Scripture. I mean, would you be a horrible parent if your children turned you over to the authorities to be killed? Jesus said that's going to happen. Are we now as evangelicals going to say, you must have been a bad parent, your kids are bitter? No. And we're moving into a society now where we are no longer the elite. The millennials are looking at things differently. And so are you a bad parent because they listen to the voice that's going to be contrary to that? You're going to have to decide. This is powerful stuff. This is why Paul, though, appeals to children. Children, obey your parents. In Ephesians 6, Colossians 3. Why? He doesn't say, parents, have your children obey. No, he goes right to the kids. Why? Because they are moral, spiritual beings who are free to either obey or disobey. They are free. It's their decision. It's their decision. But I want you to know you can affect them when you do this. I mean, there was a father who wrote me, and he was helping his 4-year-old boy. They wanted ice cream. They were scooping out the ice cream, and the 4-year-old boy wanted to do it. And so he let him do the scoop, and it went up in the air, the ice cream, and then it fell right on the floor, splat. The dad was tired, exhausted, and he screamed, I can't believe it. I should have done it myself. I can't believe you just did that. The little boy, 4 years old, just got down off the stool and left the kitchen and went into the living room. And as the dad is cleaning everything up, the Lord speaks to him. That was wrong. And so he realized he needed to seek his son's forgiveness. So he goes into the other room. His little boy just standing there stoically looking out the window. He gets down on his knees and he said, son, I was wrong. Will you forgive me? Daddy sinned against you. I was wrong. The little boy burst into tears, turned around and embraced his father. He's a little person, a spiritual being who has feelings and knows right and wrong. But he was stoic, and that was me. My dad never sought my forgiveness. He never tried to influence my heart. There's no guarantee that I would have responded. Why? Because I'm a moral, spiritual being who's free to either decide to forgive or not to forgive. That's not the issue. The issue is, would my dad influence my heart? I was 29 before I ever heard him say, I love you. He's on a phone call. As he's ready to say goodbye, he said, I love you. And I thought, wow. I knew he loved me, but again, do you always feel the love that your parents feel? But here's how you influence. Some of you are 78 years old and your children are 50, but you can get on the phone and say, you know what? I need to seek your forgiveness. They may or may not forgive you, but that's not the point. You want to touch the heart of Christ, because that leads us to our third point. The third point is, where is Christ in all of this? Who is Christ in all of this? And is that even relevant? It's interesting. When you look at this father and you see this episode, he says to the son, says, Father, I've sinned against heaven. Sinned against heaven. Where did that come from? How did he get this God consciousness? I think from his father. He said, I've sinned against heaven and against you. It wasn't just the horizontal. And maybe through the years the father said, son, it's not just about me. It's not just about you, but it's about our heavenly Father. It's about heaven and the heart of God. He's watching. He's there. So here's the deal. Where does Christ fit into all this? He's watching and rewarding your love. And to succeed as a parent in God's eyes, we must parent unto Jesus Christ to hear well done. See, Jesus said, as you've done it to the least of these, you've done it to me. And Paul in Colossians 3 and Colossians 5 and 6, he's talking about marriage. He's talking about fathers and children, the whole family situation. In both these situations, masters and slaves, and you see this motif, this ongoing theme, as to the Lord, as to the Lord, as to the Lord, as to the Lord, as to the Lord. Whatever good thing each one does, this he'll receive back from the Lord. New International says will be rewarded. This is a powerful teaching. What Paul is saying, it's not about the people in front of you. It's about Jesus Christ, who stands beyond the shoulder of your spouse, who stands beyond the shoulder of your child. You do it unto Christ. So here's the deal. You can succeed in God's eyes as you parent unto Christ, who's beyond your child. It isn't about your child. Your child is irrelevant. And that was the point I made in the Fox News article, why biblical parenting has nothing to do with your children. It has everything to do with us loving Christ more than our children, loving Christ beyond our children. As you've done it to the least of these, you've done it to me. Once I began to realize, whoa, this is more about my obedience to Christ than my children's obedience to me. Once that happened, it liberated me, but it also liberates the children. Because at the end of the day, this is a two-part thing. It's not just them. Might doesn't make right. It isn't them being answerable and accountable to me. I'm answerable, accountable to God. But here's the deal. Even if they don't obey me, I can obey God. And even in the midst of their disobedience, I can demonstrate my obedience. And I can touch the heart of Christ by the way I parent. And especially when I do it under Christ, to touch the heart of Christ. Nothing I do is wasted. Everything counts. Have you caught that? When our Facebook and our social media, and last year we become very intentional, and so it exploded with over 1 million people in our feed. Just exploded. And so now I'm putting out content every day. It's all free. But I get this feedback because it helps me understand where people are at. And here's what I recently put on Facebook, and the response said to me that this point that I'm just now making to you, people aren't paying attention to it, and they're Christ followers. But here's what I wrote. With eyes of faith, envision Jesus standing just beyond the shoulder of your spouse or child and listening to every word you speak in every conversation. whether pleasant or tense. And when you speak lovingly or respectfully to your spouse or child, you are speaking to Christ. Your spouse or child just happens to be there too. Well, people started responding. I mean, this is just an illustration. I didn't know that. That was enlightening. Wow, I wish I'd heard that many years ago. Another mind-opening. Wowzer. Wowzer, I didn't. Speak to God in your conversation with your spouse. Oh my goodness, mind-opening, learned a valuable lesson today. I never thought of it that way. It's going to have to change how I speak. Makes me rethink how I speak to my children. Puts a whole new light on things, doesn't it? Makes me want to watch how I speak. Oh man, I needed that. Thank you so much. Or this person, that's a great visual. Now this is powerful to even imagine. This revelation's changed how I treat everybody. It's one of those statements that stays with you. It's so good. Another said, this is beautiful. Cold chills. Wow, that's deep. That's a deep thought. Even knowing that this is so true, just the reminder makes you want to pay closer attention to what is said. Thanks. As I listen to these kinds of responses, I'm realizing these are Christ followers. I'm thinking, shouldn't they know that? Jesus said, as you've done to the least of these, you've done to me. I mean, everybody knows that. And they know, as to the Lord, as to the Lord. But we don't make a connection between Christ and our children. We don't make a connection between Christ and our marriage. It's like, it's two separate worlds. No, no, no. So in conclusion, here's the deal. You can succeed in God's eyes if you choose to be a loving person independent of your children. You can succeed in God's eyes if you choose to influence their heart in God's way. And I explain in my book, I call it Guides, Guides, which is every passage to parents about parenting. When you apply guides, you're influencing the heart of your children God's way, and it's going to lead to this third thing. You're going to hear well done. You're going to do this unto Christ, and you're going to hear well done, and he's going to reward you. Paul is very clear on this. Jesus is very clear on this. Nothing you do is wasted, even if your children do not respond. Do you believe that? Do you believe that? And if you do that, do you believe that you're succeeding in God's eyes even if your children do not follow your faith and values? Some of you need to come out from under this guilt and shame and re-enter into the cause of Christ even though your children aren't who you want them to be. Be free.